Welcome to Into the Words, a podcast from the Highlights Foundation Retreat Center. Today in our cabin is our dear friend, Matthew Winner. Matthew, welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for having me.
We're so glad to have you here as a special guest at our summer camp mentorship this week. Tell us a little bit about what you're up to here at summer camp.
So I am here both as a librarian and as a writer. I'm talking to our attendees about picture books and about how we can use picture books as mentor texts to understand what makes a book engaging, to find the voice in your story, and to hopefully tap into rereadability.
What? Explain to me rereadability.
Oh, this is the thing we want in all of our books. We want our book not just to be read one time, but to maintain the joy and the fun and the draw read after read after read. Because ideally, I will, as a librarian, be reading this book to all of my second, third, and fourth graders, or to my 4-year-old daughter every night at bed. We want the child, the reader, as well as the adult reader, to want to return to your book. We want that book to stay on the mind of the reader.
So this afternoon, maybe you can't quite pull it apart, but are you talking as a librarian or are you talking as a children's book author?
I don't know that I can ever pull it apart. I think it's safest to say I'll be speaking as a reader. My session, I think we're calling it Writers Are Readers. But the focus will be on different questions we ask ourselves as we read books. Am I qualified to write this story? What part of me did I put into this story as a writer? What will my readers take from this story? Or where have I saved space for the reader to find their own interpretations and their own connections in my story? Those questions and more are what will guide a lot of my interactions with our attendees today.
Wow. Can't wait for that session. So now back up a little bit and tell me a little bit about you.
Okay, I am a school librarian of now 15 years. I worked for 14 years in a public education system outside of Baltimore, Maryland. And this fall, I'll be starting at an independent school, McDonough, which is in Owings Mills, Maryland. But I'll still be a school librarian, pre-K to 4. I knew from, I think, an early age that I loved creativity and imagination and building worlds with other people. I did not know that I would be entering into education, but working at a summer camp, I think, helped instill in me that there's no better thing than working with children and being around their brilliance all the time. And I really mean that. I try to learn as much as I can from my learners every day. I started writing, though, probably formally, after I started teaching and after I was reading aloud constantly to children, thinking, I think I have stories to tell as well. But I think I've been on a journey as a writer, and I've also been on a journey with how I write and what my process looks like, because I am a full-time teacher and because now I have children, and the time I have to write looks different than it did 5 years ago and 10 years ago. And also the stories that I want to express myself through look different as I've come to know myself better.
Sounds like a writing journey.
Indeed.
So tell me a little bit about your current kind of writing process or practice. You allude to the fact that you do have a full-time job and a family.
Yeah. I think that it was actually after my first visit to Highlights that I realized I needed to give myself permission to focus on teaching and family during the school year, and on those breaks, focus on writing. Because for me, finding the mental space as well as the time to write with any sort of regular habit during the school year was really hard. I have a stressful job. Stressful maybe in part because I put so much of myself into it, and because I'm really trying to see my students and be there for them while I'm teaching, and then be there for my wife and my kids while I'm at home. So getting tapped into my writing comes more easily over the summer, and it's easier to build a habit over the summer for me. So that's where I am now. That summer is my time to write. And you better believe that as soon as the end of the school year came and we were past the ALA conference, I jumped right back into writing. Now, writing for me looks different because of writing different projects, but I try to pick up on writing what I feel drawn to that day, whether it's writing picture books or writing comics or working on a nonfiction anthology that I've been chipping away at. It really is, where do I feel like I want to focus today? Maybe it's on the ideation process of just brainstorming story ideas, or maybe it's just getting words out of my head so that so that the good ideas can flow more freely.
Yeah, it's been interesting to do these interviews and hear different people talk about their writing process. And some are very strict with the practice. I write words every day kind of a thing. And others say, as long as I think about my character or my story for a few minutes every day, I don't actually have to have words on a page.
I've had a number of friends remind me that when I'm doing that mental work of working out a story, asking questions of my characters in my story, that is writing too. So I probably do a lot more writing even during the school year than I give myself credit for, because I am thinking about these stories and I am taking little notes mentally or on paper about these characters. But something I've really come to recognize too through my own podcast, through the Children's Book Podcast, and interviewing so many authors and illustrators, is that every single person has their own process, and all of these processes change depending on how life is changing around you, and that's okay. So I've had to learn to give myself grace and know that my process is what's right for me.
And give yourself permission when it's okay to not be in a strict writing practice.
Definitely.
Can you tell me about a project you're working on right now that's either has you stuck or excited?
Ooh, all the projects. Right now, I am... Well, I'll say first, the adventure I'm going on is that a number of my critique partners and friends over the years have mentioned to me, this picture book, it feels more like a chapter book or a middle grade. Have you ever considered writing for a little bit older? And I've said, no. And finally, one more person told me that, and I thought, I guess I should probably give myself permission to try writing something else. So that's been fun to be outlining what I hope, I think, will be a chapter book or middle grade novel, but allowing the story to be a little more robust. I haven't committed myself to writing it yet, but it's helped me to have a big idea and break it down into a more detailed outline. And right now I'm working to a finely detailed outline. I think that then it will feel maybe not as intimidating to actually write a series of chapters. But the other project that's taking up a lot of my mental space and excitement is that I'm working on an anthology of sorts that is focused around the work I do directly with the link between my interviews with guests and how that directly informs the conversations I'm having with my readers every day in my library. I don't want to go into too much detail about it because it's still taking shape and I'm working on a proposal for it, but it's neat to be working in the concept stage because if this project moves forward, which I think it will, I will be involving a number of different authors and illustrators to contribute to this, but we'll also have me in it speaking or making that bridge directly between author, illustrator, and reader, and where the reader sees themselves in that connection through these, through the ways that, all writers and illustrators, they have these readers in mind always as they make them. But when I was growing up, I don't think I even realized that there was really a person behind a book. But to know that person is making it for me is a big deal. So I'm working on as I said, like an anthology of sorts that will hopefully serve readers and also bridge gaps.
Sounds like a great combination of you.
I feel like I'm uniquely suited to do this, and that feels neat to think that all this work I've been doing on the podcast and in libraries, this feels like a project that's an expression of me and an expression of how I always work to center readers. It feels good.
So Matthew, you've told us about your teaching as a librarian, your writing practice, and you've alluded to your podcast, but talk to us, tell me a little more about the podcast. I think I listened yesterday and you were at episode 500 and something.
Yeah, I think I'm up to 520, very close to it. If not, I've recorded many more than that, just haven't, I've released them once a week. 6 years ago, almost to the day, I was at ALA, American Library Association's annual conference. It was held in Chicago. I was being recognized for receiving a big library award called the Library Journal Mover and Shaker Award. Wow. I was recognized for my work with technology integration, in particular with bringing video games into the classroom, with engaging learners through gaming. And a friend of mine, when we were hanging out at the bar, librarians and authors, we were all just chatting, hanging out as you do. And he said, "So what's next? What's your next project?" And I said, "Well, I've been listening to so many podcasts, and I really want to just make recordings of these moments of just picking up with an author, already knowing their work, but recording that conversation where I see you and we're just talking about where life and story intersect." And he said, "Well, when are you going to start?" And so that week, I sat down and recorded an interview with my friend, Sherry, where we just talked about the value of going to conferences. And that was the first episode of, at the time it was called the Let's Get Busy podcast, because I had a blog called Busy Librarian, so the Let's Get Busy podcast. A couple years later, I co-founded a website called All the Wonders with my friend, and it made sense that the podcast being sort of the flagship content of that website would just then rebrand to be called All the Wonders, the Children's Book Podcast. I later stepped away from that website. Actually, ultimately, the website later went on a hiatus, closed down. And at the time, I had handed over the rights for the name of the website and all that to my co-founder. And so that also meant, because he holds the LLC on the website, that I would have to change the name, which was fine. I think it was time for that. And that's when my podcast rebranded for the third time to the Children's Book Podcast. And that's where I've stayed. And I think that name really says what it is. Right. But the interviews that I have with authors hasn't changed. With authors, illustrators, editors, agents, it's still seeking that intimate conversation where I love their book or their work, and I just want to capture in an unedited conversation what it means to really see their work and how they are seeing readers through their work. And so, yeah, we've hit episode 520. I do my best to center marginalized voices. I really value my readers seeing themselves in people that make books. So it's important to me that the faces of my guests also face out on my website so that they can see who's behind these books. And I've learned a lot. What people don't realize, or maybe they do, is that it's sort of selfishly been a masterclass for me. So I've learned that it's okay to be an author of graphic novels, but not an illustrator, not a cartoonist. And it's okay to write a picture book that you're sure is a picture book and then try it as a middle grade and realize, actually, that character had more to say. It's sort of just shown me, and hopefully everyone listening, that there's no one path except for your path. That's the important path.
Well, thank you. I certainly enjoy listening to your podcast. I think you're right. It's just kind of the intimacy of the conversation that really helps you get to know the author, the illustrator, the story, and the person. So thank you.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that you listen. I recently started a second podcast with a middle grade author, Karina Yan Glaser. We had the opportunity to pitch a podcast to Book Riot, big book website. And they didn't have any children's book podcasts. So we pitched and have now just hit episode 9 or 10 of Kidlit these days, where we examine the intersection of current events and children's literature. So it's sort of the most NPR-aligned thing I've ever done, and I love it. But we've looked at the border wall and what one Oklahoma school staff did that really marginalized a lot of children in dressing up in costumes for Halloween that stereotyped actually a large faction of their students. We looked at Pride Month and what it means to center trans characters in queer literature. We've interviewed folks, Sadia Faruqi, who writes the Yasmin series, about demystifying the hijab. We keep looking at current events in U.S. culture and in world culture and where books now are helping to open those conversations for parents and children and students and teachers. And we keep shining a light as best as we can on not only an individual, a guest, who is working in that field, but also curating a book list so that there's a place for readers to go to find own voices and to learn more through those experiences that we couldn't ever live in one lifetime, but we can through books.
That's valuable. Now tell me the name of that podcast one more time.
That's called Kidlit These Days.
Awesome.
And it's on Book Riot.
Well, thank you, Matthew Winter, for joining us on Into the Words here at the Highlights Foundation Retreat Center. We are dedicated to continuing our 35-year history of providing the space, the conversations, and the nurturing that goes into making great stories for children. Thank you for being a part of the Highlights Foundation. And more importantly, thank you for everything you do to support that belief that children are the world's most important people.
Thank you, George Brown. Thank you, Highlights.